Society Phoenix Lawyers Chapter. We're thrilled to have a really top-notch debate today. I'm just really excited about everybody that's up here. As is our usual policy, we make very brief introductions because the goal is to get to the meat of the matter, as it were. So I would like to introduce Justice Bob Brutinel, who will be our moderator today. And sorry, pardon me, Justice, I actually forgot two things I need to let you know. Anybody who is getting CLE credit for this, you need to make sure you've checked in and provided your email address for providing the written materials electronically for this event. And anybody that would like to purchase Mr. Balko's book, it's available for purchase for $20 for both of those things. C. Killeen, who's in the back of the room, you probably saw her when you checked in. Okay, so Justice Bob Brutinel is joining us as our moderator today. For those of you who are attorneys in the area, you can rest assured he has alliances with both Tucson and Phoenix. He got his bachelor's degree at, ASU and his JD at the University of Arizona. So divided house, I guess. He has been a justice on the Arizona Supreme Court since 2010. Prior to that, he served for about 15 years on the Superior Court as a judge, and before that, he served in private practice. He's got a long and distinguished career in Arizona, so I won't go through all the details. I will highlight that he was the National CASA Judge of the Year in 2010 and has served the community up there. It's Yavapai County, right? Just excellently was a top-notch judge and attorney up there before becoming Supreme Court Justice. So I'm going to turn it over to Justice Brutinel for further introductions, and then we'll get rolling.
Thank you. Welcome, and it's a privilege to be here today to participate in this. I've already purchased Mr. Balko's book. I get him to sign it for me, but the iPad I have belongs to the state. That would be embarrassing. I'll take Jennifer's hint, and so I'll just engage in some brief introductions. The format today, we'll hear from Mr. Balko for 20 minutes. We'll hear from Mr. Montgomery for 20 minutes. We'll have a brief response from Mr. Balko, and then we'll have questions from all of you for the remainder of the time. The Honorable Bill Montgomery was first elected as Maricopa County Attorney in 2010 and re-elected in 2012. He's a graduate of West Point and of ASU's College of Law, where he graduated magna cum laude. He's also a decorated Gulf War veteran and a career prosecutor here in Maricopa County. His official bio says that Bill is committed to vigorously prosecuting crimes and holding criminals accountable. He's committed to partnering with law enforcement along with business and civic leaders to protect the strength of communities, and he also recognizes the citizen's right to defend his or her family without fear of prosecution. And I'm personally familiar with Bill's work in trying to reform child protective services. He's been actively involved in that as part of this current crisis. Please welcome Bill Montgomery. Radley Balko is a writer and investigative reporter. He covers civil liberties and the criminal justice system, and he also writes about music and culture in Nashville, Tennessee, which, as I told him, I am envious. He moved there from Washington, D.C. He described the difference between those two communities in his blog as people move to Washington because they see themselves as becoming president someday. People move to Nashville because they see themselves opening for Willie Nelson someday. I find the latter to be a much nobler ambition, which I think I agree. He's a graduate of Indiana University, a former senior editor for Reason magazine, and a senior writer and investigative reporter for the Huffington Post, as well as a policy analyst for the Cato Institute and an opinion columnist for FoxNews.com. His work has been cited by the United States Supreme Court and cited and excerpted by the Mississippi State Supreme Court, and his work has been profiled in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Economist, and a Showtime show for Penn and Teller, which is called, never mind. He currently blogs about criminal justice, the drug war, and civil liberties for the Washington Post, and he is the author of Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Force, which is going to form the basis for our discussion today. And without further introduction, please welcome Mr. Balko. Mr. Balko, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you to the Federalist Society for setting all this up. The Institute for Justice, I think, had a role in that as well. Thank you to my co-panelists and, of course, all of you for coming out. Actually, just this morning, as I was going through sort of my news sources, I read about a settlement in Georgia in the Jonathan Ayers case. This just happened today, actually. Ayers was a pastor in Georgia who was ministering to a local woman who was both a prostitute and whom police had suspected of some drug activity I don't mean ministering euphemistically, he was actually ministering to her. Because he was working with this woman, the police at one point, as they were following or suspected that he was involved in drug activity, they followed, this narcotics task force followed him to a convenience store. He went in, got some money out of an ATM, came back to his car. SUV rolled up into the gas station. Several men with guns wearing undercover, these were all police officers and undercover, so they were sort of dressed like drug dealers or drug users. So a bunch of men with guns and street clothes came running at his car. He pulled up to get out of the way, nicked one of the officers in the process. They opened fire and killed him. He died on the way to his hospital. The last thing he said, according to the doctors, was, "I didn't know it was the police." In any case, the county settled with his widow today for $23 million. Earlier this week in Alabama, there was a SWAT raid on a massage parlor where police suspected the women were giving more than massages. But as part of the raid, all the officers, you can see the video online from a local news station, they're wearing face masks that cover their entire faces, they're wearing battle dress uniforms, carrying assault weapons. They broke into the place with a battering ram, this again for people suspected of giving extras with massages. But we've seen this over and over again. Last summer there was a massive SWAT raid on an organic farm in Texas. The woman who owned the farm was battling with local authorities over some zoning issues, including that her grass was too high and she had some furniture out on her lawn. For this, a SWAT team raided her, held her and the other occupants of the property for several hours at gunpoint. Also, just yesterday, I got another story about a SWAT deployment in Texas. There was an auto repair shop where a customer had complained to local authorities that the shop was had sold parts to him as new that were actually used. In order to investigate, the local authorities sent the SWAT team in to secure the premises of the auto shop. The criminologist Peter Kraska, who's done surveys of SWAT teams across the country, estimates that there are 60 to 80,000 SWAT raids per year in the United States today. It boils down to 165 to 220 per day. It's also found that the vast majority of those raids are to serve search warrants on people suspected of drug crimes. Maryland is the only state that actually officially tracks the number of SWAT raids every year in the state. They've been doing that for about 3 years, and what we found, there are about 4.5 SWAT raids every day just in the state of Maryland. About half of these are for offenses that the FBI classifies as misdemeanors and non-serious felonies. If you extrapolate those 4.5 per day in Maryland, by the way, there's no other states doing it, we don't know if that's low or high compared to other states, but if you were to extrapolate that to the population as a whole, you would get about 225 SWAT raids per day in the United States. So I want to talk quickly about how we got here. Give you some quick history. The SWAT team concept was invented by Daryl Gates, the former LAPD police chief. And it was in response to the Watts riots, which Gates likened to a form of, sort of urban guerrilla warfare. These were unlike riots the United States had ever seen before. And Gates thought that in a time of a lot of civil unrest in this country, that LAPD did not have an adequate way to respond to these emergency sorts of situations. So he came up with this idea of having this very elite, highly trained police team that could sort of swoop in when there was a violent crime that was in the process of being committed, and they could use overwhelming force and violence to defuse the threat as quickly as possible. Again, the idea was you're using violence to defuse an already violent situation. The idea was you're sending the SWAT team in when their lives are at immediate risk, when someone is in the process of committing a violent crime. I'll draw a distinction of this in a little bit. Throughout the 1970s, SWAT teams spread across the country. There were a few high-profile incidents. There was a TV show. But for the most part, they were reserved for these emergency-type situations. If you think hostage takings or bank robberies, an escaped fugitive, a suspected murderer who's sort of on the lam. The idea is you're using violence to diffuse a situation that's already violent. It's really during the Reagan administration that we start to see SWAT teams used more routinely the way they are today. And that's because of a number of policies that Reagan passed in the name of advancing the drug war and making the drug war metaphor quite a bit more literal. One of these was Reagan instructed the Pentagon to start giving surplus military equipment to police departments across the country. Since then, this has been formalized. It's sometimes known as the 1033 law, with literally millions of pieces of equipment have been transferred to local police departments from the Pentagon through this program. And we're talking about some mundane things like computers and office furniture, but we're also talking about helicopters and tanks and armored personnel carriers, M16s, grenade launchers, bayonets. For some reason, police departments love bayonets. And so this is equipment that was designed for use on a battlefield, to annihilate a foreign enemy that's now being used on U.S. streets and against U.S. citizens. A number of the weapons that have been transferred this way include, as I understand it, several of these guns, or at least 2 of these guns, and there may be more here in Maricopa County, guns that shoot 50 caliber ammunition. In fact, there is one here in Maricopa County that's a belt-fed machine gun that shoots 50 caliber ammunition. Now, even the military has some restrictions on when 50 caliber ammunition can be used. It'll go through 7 or 8 city blocks. 50 cal bullet will, no matter what's standing in its way. This is completely inappropriate for domestic police work, yet there are police departments across the country now that have tanks with rotating gun turrets that shoot 50 caliber ammunition. The other program that Reagan initiates that really kind of got us to where we are today is he institutes a series of federal grants that are exclusively available to police departments across the country for drug policing and for no other crimes. We see this today in the burn grants, the high intensity drug trafficking area grants, a number of other federal programs. And this is money that is solely for the purpose of drug policing. So if you think about what this does, imagine you're a small town police chief, you get a bunch of equipment from the Pentagon, you start your own SWAT team because everybody else is doing it. Now you can keep your SWAT team in reserve and wait for one of those emergency type situations where this kind of force is appropriate, or you can start sending your SWAT team out on drug raids and actually generate revenue for your police department. You combine this with civil asset forfeiture policies, and the copious use of SWAT team now can become a revenue generator for a police agency. This is why we see the explosion, both the number and frequency of use of SWAT teams throughout the 1980s and 1990s. According to Professor Kraska's research, in the late 70s there were about 300 SWAT raids per year in the United States across the entire country. By the early 1980s, we're up to about 3,000. When Kraska did his follow-up survey in 2005, we were at 50,000. And given that the policies that have driven this trend are still with us, he estimates we're somewhere between 60 and 80,000 per day today. I want to talk about 2 sort of key moments in this discussion where I think we enter into some scary new territory. First comes in 1996 when California legalizes medical marijuana. Up until this point, the justification from police groups and the government for using this kind of force was that drug dealers are dangerous people, they're career criminals, they wouldn't hesitate before killing a bunch of police officers. I think there are rebuttals to all these arguments. A lot of them have been argued to me by former police officers and police chiefs, but at least the government was making the argument, right? We have to use this kind of force because of the threat we're facing. When California legalizes medical marijuana, you had a number of pot dispensaries and grows and shops that opened up that were businesses. These were businesses licensed under state law. These were people who were openly operating. These were not underground criminal enterprises. And yet the Clinton administration and every administration since responded by sending federal SWAT teams in to raid these clinics and dispensaries. Now, the hippie mom and pop couple that run the pod shop, the AIDS and cancer patients who are getting medical marijuana treatment at one of these facilities, none of these people are threats to pull out a gun from under the counter and murder a bunch of federal agents, right? This was about sending a message. These businesses were openly flouting federal law, therefore the federal government had to make an example of them. This is not the sort of thing we normally associate with free societies. Right? We give the government permission to use force to protect us from threats. Free societies do not allow the government to use force and violence in order to make examples of people or to send a political message. But that's exactly what was happening in California and has been happening ever since. In fact, there have been more medical marijuana raids under the Obama administration in 5 years than there were under Bush in 8. So the problem is actually getting worse. The other kind of milestone moment that we've seen probably over the last 7 or 8 years is mission creep among SWAT teams to go even above and beyond the drug war. We now see SWAT teams, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, being used to enforce regulatory law. There have been several cases where SWAT teams have been sent to bars where police suspected there was underage drinking going on. In Orlando a few years ago, there were a number of SWAT raids on barbershops across the city where police suspected there was drug activity going on, but they actually did not have enough evidence to get a warrant. So they called up the state's occupational licensing board and sent an inspector along. And officially, these were raids to see that all of these barbers were properly licensed to cut hair, but they were being enforced with the SWAT team. there's actually a split, believe it or not, in the federal circuits right now about whether or not it is appropriate to use a SWAT team, whether it's reasonable under the Fourth Amendment, to use a SWAT team to enforce regulatory law. There's actually debate in the federal courts on this issue. So there are two principles that I think Federalist Society folks, many folks could agree on that are kind of at stake here. First, though, I want to talk, well, the Castle Doctrine and Posse Comitatus are the two principles. So let me talk first and briefly about the Castle Doctrine. So the Castle Doctrine, of course, is this idea that the home is a place of peace and sanctuary, right? That it should be a place where you can seek refuge with your family and you don't have to worry about people doing you or your relatives harm. The Castle Doctrine, part of the Castle Doctrine is the knock and announce rule. It says that if the government wants to send people into your home, the agents have to knock, announce themselves, and announce their purpose, and give you time to come to the door to avoid unnecessary violence and destruction of your property. The Castle Doctrine, the knock and announce rule, go back centuries in the English common law. They have a long tradition here in U.S. law, and it's a kind of a cherished principle in this country. This is why we have Castle Doctrine laws across the country that say if you feel threatened in your own home, there's no duty to retreat before you can use force to defend yourself. What's happened with these raids and the proliferation of these raids is that they've really started to chip away at the Castle Doctrine. I'll give you one Supreme Court case that I think really embodies what's happened, and that's U.S. versus Banks, which I believe is in 2003, I think. In that case, it was actually a unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court. In this case, a guy was taking a shower, the police came, knocked and announced themselves. I think they waited 15 or 18 seconds, didn't get an answer, and sort of broke their way in and found some drugs. He sued, said that this was a violation of the knock and announce rule in the Castle Doctrine, that they should have waited longer for him to get to the door. The Supreme Court said 15 to 18 seconds was plenty of time, but what was notable is the way they defended that decision. It was a unanimous decision. The court said basically that the amount of time police should wait has nothing to do with how long it would take a homeowner, an innocent homeowner, to come to the door and let the police in to avoid violence and destruction of property. That's what the Castle Doctrine is long based on. Instead, the Supreme Court said that the reasonable amount of time should be calculated by how long it would take someone to destroy evidence that might be in the home that police are looking for. So we went from assuming that homeowners were innocent and giving them an opportunity to avoid violence and destruction to assuming everyone inside is guilty, and we're going to calculate this time by how long it would take you to destroy the evidence. Now, that exigent circumstance, that exception to the Castle Doctrine for disposal of evidence, is also pretty absurd when you think about it. It actually gives more protection to people who are small-time drug dealers, if you have a small enough quantity that you can flush it down the toilet quickly, than a big-time drug dealer. Let's say you have lots of bricks of marijuana or cocaine, which can't be easily disposed of. It also allows police to use this extraordinary violence and these volatile tactics in order to preserve a conviction of someone who has a small enough quantity of drugs that they can be quickly disposed of. Very quickly, I would talk about one of the tactics used in these raids are flash grenades, and I think it's important to talk about because I think they illustrate the disconnect here. Several years ago, CNN did a report about several FBI agents who were pretty severely injured when a flashbang grenade prematurely detonated before they were ready, and it subjected them all to some pretty serious injuries, loss of hearing, some burns. And I remember watching this report and being sort of in awe of the description of just how bad these injuries were and how this company was, actually the federal government pursued criminal charges against this company for making a defective product. But when you think about it, these flash grenades are used every day in this country in these raids. They're usually tossed into the house sort of blindly before the police come in. The idea is to temporarily injure people, to stun them, it's a flash of white light, there's a loud noise, and the idea is to stun people inside so the police can get in quickly while everyone's still being taken by surprise. So in other words, this weapon that is used against people routinely prematurely detonated and subjected these FBI agents to the same thing that regular people who are suspected of crimes are subjected to all the time. The disconnect, I think, became very apparent, although CNN didn't report it that way. I want to get to the other issue very quickly, posse comitatus. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the term. There's some confusion about what the law actually does, but I think symbolically, posse comitatus has come to symbolize this idea that in the United States or in free societies, the military is kept secret from domestic policing, right? These are two very institutions with two very different charges. The military's job is to annihilate a foreign enemy, to kill people and break things. Police officers' job is to keep the peace, to protect our constitutional rights. Norm Stamper, the former police chief of Seattle, who I interviewed for my book, put it differently, but I think also eloquently. He said a soldier's job is to follow orders, a police officer's job is to make decisions. We've done a pretty good job in this country of keeping the military out of domestic policing. There have been a few exceptions, most notably Reconstruction, which I would argue was justified. But for the most part, we have understood the military should not be used in routine policing. And what I think, in a healthy way, the institution that's most enforced that notion is the military itself. In the 80s, when Congress and the Reagan administration wanted to bring the military in to actively fight the drug war on American streets, it was the military that objected. But where we've dropped the ball, I think, is that we've allowed our police officers to become more and more like soldiers and to assume the mindset of soldiers. And if your worry is that the missions of these two institutions are so different and shouldn't be commingled, when we start taking police officers and we dress them like soldiers and we give them soldiers' weapons and we train them in military tactics, and then we send them out on the streets and tell them they're fighting one of various wars, we should not be surprised if some police officers then assume the mentality of soldiers and begin to see the people they're supposed to be serving as a potential enemy or a potential threat. I'll give you one example. When my book came out, the website Police One commissioned some essays from police officers across the country in response. And one of them was from an officer in the commander of the SWAT team in Sterling Heights, Michigan. And his response was basically, "You're damn right, I'm a soldier." He referred to his beat as his sector. He referred to his job as his tour. In this essay, he actually said the police officers today, their jobs are more dangerous than those of active duty troops in Afghanistan. Sterling Heights, Michigan is a wealthy suburb of Detroit. I think they've had one murder in the last 7 or 8 years. In fact, it was once named the safest city in Michigan. Now, if that's the city that this police officer sees as a battleground or a battlefield, you can imagine sort of what's going on across the country. And this is where my final point is that I think this culture of militarization has spilled out beyond the SWAT team. And I think police officers today, they're constantly being told how dangerous their jobs are. In fact, their job is as safe as it's ever been. And when police officers are constantly told that every interaction with a citizen could be their last, they will start to see people as potential threats and not citizens with rights. If you go to YouTube, you can Google police recruitment video, and you can see the videos that police departments send to high schools and colleges across the country to recruit new police officers. And the majority of them are pretty disturbing. The images are of cops rappelling out of helicopters and tackling people and shooting at things, sicking dogs on people. This is the very first step in the process, right? This is what the police departments think are the important aspects of the job. Now, I went to high school with some people who I think would watch that video and say, that's what I want to do with my life. Those are not the people that I would want to be giving a gun and a badge to. It's appealing to all the wrong parts of police work. There's very little emphasis on community policing, but I think it's symbolic sort of where the police culture is headed over the last generation or so. I'll just end by saying a quote that's commonly attributed to Winston Churchill, although I haven't found proof he actually said it. But it's from the Cold War, and the quote is that democracy means that when there's a knock on the door at 3 a.m., it's probably the milkman. And it was a sense in the Cold War era that in free societies, in democratic societies, the government doesn't send men in black banging on your door in the middle of the night to enforce what are essentially political crimes. And I would submit that, given the numbers that I cited earlier, not only have we become very comfortable with that notion, we've also become comfortable with the idea that they don't even have to knock. Thank you.
Mr. Montgomery.
Thank you very much, Justice Brutinel, and appreciate the Federalist Society putting this on, and our friends from the Institute for Justice being here, and Mr. Balko for coming out west to spend the afternoon. And I'll address initially the specific topic about law enforcement tactics and the appropriate response, and then address some of the other claims or points that are referenced either in Mr. Balko's book or in the law review article that is among the first cited in the book too, and some of the other, I'll be kind, scholarship that addresses the militarization of policing. What came first, the cop or the robber? What happened first? criminals taking up arms against police, or police going out and purchasing at local municipal government expense high caliber weapons. Over the course of time since policing began in the United States, what we've seen is that law enforcement has responded to the demands of local citizenry expressed through their local elected officials. And when we talk about policing in general, if we conflate the difference between federal law enforcement agencies with local municipal agencies, it makes it much easier to characterize law enforcement in general. But the more you paint broad brushstrokes from discrete incidents, it makes it easier to conflate not just federal and local law enforcement, but it also makes it easier to make the point, or to try to make the point, that simply purchasing equipment, adopting tactics, is going to make a difference between whether or not a local police department is now all of a sudden part of the 101st Airborne Division. That's not accurate. The only way you could confuse local police with our nation's military is through abject ignorance or deliberate indifference to the fundamental distinctions between each type of organization. From the operational structure to the fundamental purpose, and Mr. Balko did mention this, so this isn't a direct criticism against him, to the sources of authority and the level of government served, local police and the military are on opposite scales. To confuse tactics with mission and equipment with purpose is the only avenue for the irresponsible abuse of the term militarization of policing. It fails to inform legitimate debate that only inflames passions through confusion. And at the outset, let me be perfectly clear. Instances including the two that Mr. Balko mentioned at the beginning this afternoon are instances of abuse of power. And that occurs whether through the use of force or the abuse of the criminal justice system. And they deserve recrimination and the strongest condemnation, as well as prosecution, and being subject to civil litigation and responsibility in that form as well, because of the danger of undermining the confidence of the public and then fomenting civil unrest. This means prosecuting those who do abuse the sacred trust fellow citizens place in the men and women who serve and protect our businesses, our homes, and our communities. So don't mistake the vigor of my argument about trying to use the term militarization of policing for a refusal to acknowledge that we have and have had far too many instances of people who failed to uphold the sacred obligation they were entrusted with. However, the examples that are cited are not examples of militarization, but of the necessity for citizens, directly and through elected representatives, to clearly communicate expectations of performance and accountability. Nevertheless, at the same time, citizens need to be aware and alert so that you don't let the sirens of misery and the caterwauls of lament that police departments have adapted military tactics to deal with an increasingly violent repertoire of criminals and dangerous circumstances rouse you to falsely claim that our police departments are becoming militarized. That is the case, and so are our Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and heaven forbid, so are our sports teams, who, like soldiers in mountainous and rocky terrain, wear protective gear on their heads, elbows, and knees. While we're at it, I think I've even seen firefighters, there's a military term, fighter, deploy in squads, companies, and eat, sleep, and live in the same quarters just like soldiers do. And since I mentioned quartering, let me address the strained effort to cite the Third Amendment as somehow evidence of an intended dislike for standing armies, and therefore tortuously then used to argue that current police forces were not in the mindset of our founding fathers, and somehow that the Third Amendment can be used as an argument that we shouldn't have the kind of police forces that we do today. First and foremost, the Third Amendment is straight and clear in what it states, and it combines a straightforward ban on non-consensual peacetime quartering of soldiers in citizens' houses, and this is a direct criticism of the law review article I think is going to be provided, with a requirement that wartime quartering be done by means approved by the legislature. And it was the British practice of quartering soldiers because they had no bases in America that served to be a point of at issue between colonists and the crown. And in most significant instances had to deal with the intolerable acts of 1774 and related acts passed by Parliament to tax in order to raise funds to pay for an increase in the debt of Britain following the French and Indian War. Now, the use of the Third Amendment, given its clear and straightforward language,